Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Motivational Intelligence Podcast. I'm Sean Johnson, and as you know, on this podcast, it's our job to deconstruct for you what makes people and organizations successful. One of the things that makes people successful is their ability to get other people to do what they want. And that's what we're talking about today, persuasion. We're doing a deep dive on the psychology of persuasion. So you'll get an understanding of what causes people to say yes, how you can get them to say yes, what tools and techniques will help you along that path, and actually how some of these things might apply to not just convincing other people to do what you want, but convincing yourself to do what you want. So these can be used for good or for ill. Please use them for good. I know you will. But there's very powerful topics in here that will really help you from a leadership perspective, and a sales perspective. So without further ado, please enjoy this episode. We'd love to hear from you on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this, and let us know what you think, what you want to hear more of, what you want to hear less of, all that good stuff. So until next time, please enjoy this episode on Persuasion from the Motivational Intelligence Podcast.
The Motivational Intelligence Podcast is produced by the team at 2Logical. 2Logical is an international corporate training firm and the world's leading expert in motivational intelligence, which is the ability to understand, manage, and change the motives people have. 2Logical offers over 30 different keynotes, workshops, and full training courses to small, medium, and large Fortune 500 companies in 53 countries, a lot of which you're probably familiar with. Pfizer, Bank of America, GE, Constellation Brands, P&G, and more. All solutions are completely customized, and the feedback from these sessions will blow your mind. If you have any training or speaking needs or just want to say hey, head over to 2logical.com.
All right, here we are. We're back. What's happening, Dave?
Not a whole lot, Sean. Here to pick my brain.
As always. One of these days, you're just going to run out of brain to pick, I think. Did I just do it? Did I just do it? Yes.
Yes.
I think I just did it.
It's a question of how much of a wise ass response do I want to put out there, if at all. So
yeah,
that was what you just saw was the wisdom of age. You know.
Maybe I don't go there.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right. Well, if you still got brain left to pick, I wanted to talk today about persuasion.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think everybody can relate to kind of the feeling of it can be frustrating to you're trying to convince somebody of something that you know or think you know,
right.
And getting other people to buy into it, whether it's from a leadership perspective or a sales perspective, or it's, it's everywhere. We're
Sure.
always trying to persuade people. So I wanted to kind of dive into how this whole thing works, and how we can maybe, walk away with a better understanding of how do we really make decisions? How can we really persuade people? What really influences them? What kind of tools and takeaways can we go? So I wanted to start.
It's a good topic. I mean, it's interesting. So often, what we'll see, especially as we're going into corporations and things like that, you'll have people who get incredibly frustrated because they can't, persuade their boss of something, or
Sure.
they can't get the support that they want, and so you see a lot of angst happen.
Yeah.
As an outgrowth of people struggling on this front. So worthy topic.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And I feel like probably the more bureaucratic the culture or organization, probably the more frustrating that is.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to start in, I guess, more of a philosophical place, by starting with, we have this notion that we convince people of things.
Mm-hmm.
Is that accurate? Can we actually convince people of something?
Absolutely. You can really convince almost anybody of almost anything. That brings up certain ethical,
Yeah.
concerns and things along those lines. But, given, if you given time, the more extreme of what you're trying to convince somebody of, that you have to use different techniques. Isolation helps, removing, factors which would run contrary to what you're trying to convince people of. But yeah, it's been pretty well proven that on the most extreme, it's brainwashing.
Yeah.
But you can pretty much convince anybody of anything.
Okay.
If you know what you're doing.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's.
I don't want to say I can, because I don't want to have that level of responsibility,
Uh-huh.
but it can be done.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So before we get into the nitty gritty of it, you brought up a good point, which is the ethics of it.
Mm-hmm.
So before we go to the dark arts,
I know,
as it were,
really. All of a sudden, Dr. Evil's coming out.
Yeah, right.
$1 million.
How should we be thinking about it ethically? How do we know when, before getting into how we actually do this, how should we know when we should be using it, using these techniques?
I think a lot of it really comes down to intent. So are we trying to convince convince somebody of something that is in their best interest, a shared mutual best interest, or purely our own self-interest? And anytime we start to cross over into where we're trying to convince somebody of something that really is just purely to benefit us, and potentially even run contrary to their own best interests, you've just crossed over that ethical line.
Right.
And and so it really does come down to intent, I think, and from that perspective.
Yeah. No, I would wholly agree with that. All right. So now that the ethics are pinned down, let's start broad. Psychologically, what causes people to say yes?
To a very large extent, I mean, if you think about it from a psychological perspective, every decision that we make is rooted in one of two psychological drivers. We will make decisions that we see that in some way, shape, or form psychologically enhance us. So if you look at that on from a broad perspective, what is enhancement? Well, enhancement could be internal or external. It could be externally. It could be something that enhances our future opportunities. It could be it enhances our life. It could be something that offers us advancement opportunities, or in some way externally benefits us. But enhancement could entirely be internal as well. It could be it enhances our perception of ourselves, or the way that we believe others will perceive us. So we will decidedly make those decisions that we perceive enhance us, either internally or externally. The other thing the other driver, if you will, of why we say yes is preservation. Really the opposite of enhancement in that sense. So while enhancement is about either internally or externally benefiting us, preservation is much more about protecting our current stature, our current perception. So if it's external, it's keeping our lives where it is right now. Keeping our lives from sliding backwards, or in some way, shape, or form becoming more negative than they are today. Or if it's internal, it's more about jeopardizing our perception of ourselves or how others perceive us. The interesting thing about it, there's actually been a fair number of studies in this regard. There's a huge self-esteem component that also factors into persuasion.
Huh.
If somebody is if somebody is more well-grounded from an esteem perspective, they tend to be, their decision-making mechanism will tend to be more rooted in enhancement. And, therefore, if you're trying to convince them of something, if you speak more to that enhancement instinct, you'll move them more. If an individual struggles more from an esteem perspective, which studies show a larger percentage of the population does, they tend to be much more driven by the enhancement, the preservation side of things.
Yeah.
So, we see this a lot of times. If you look in from an organizational perspective, oftentimes you'll see employees who they will fight harder. So if you've got somebody who's on a commission-driven comp plan, and they, let's say, year in, year out, they tend to make around $50,000 a year. And then they'll roll into a new year. They have a couple of big sales they make in the first half of the year. They get to $50,000 in income halfway into the year. And if you sit with executives and you ask them, so what does this person do in the second half of the year? And almost universally, executives will come back and they'll go, they coast. And why? Because this person's worked to their belief system, right?
Yeah.
The crazy thing is, if you roll into the next year and that person is now in December and they've made $40,000, for the year, you'll watch them; they'll kill themselves the last half of the year, or that last month of the year, trying to get themselves closer to that $50,000 number. So they'll actually fight harder to keep from sliding backwards than they will to move forward, because they're more driven by that preservation instinct than they are by their enhancement instinct.
Interesting. So, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's probably it's where rule by fear comes from.
Oh, absolutely. Well, fear of guilt. The easiest way to manipulate somebody who has an esteem problem is with guilt.
Yeah.
In fact, oftentimes you'll watch people who struggle with an esteem perspective. They try to manipulate others with guilt very often too, because they assume that because guilt is a trigger for them, it's a trigger for everybody else.
Right. Well, yeah, that's an interesting point too. Is which I think maybe we can get into a little bit more, but I think that's probably the reaction for, or the impulse for a lot of people, is they try to persuade other people, maybe probably unconsciously, but they're trying to persuade other people the way that they are persuaded.
Oh, absolutely.
That they make decisions or what they're driven by, without really understanding what the other person is driven by.
And that's part of what drives, we talked earlier about the frustration that people have when, they're trying to convince somebody of something, but that person's not moving in the way. And what they fail to realize is they're trying to, in essence, sell that person on why this person should say yes to this or support, this decision. But they're selling it purely from the perspective of what's important to them,
right,
rather than thinking about
what's important.
How am I communicating this in a way that means something to the person I'm trying to convince?
Yeah.
That's a big aspect of persuasion is kind of speaking to that person in their own language,
Sure.
or thinking about how am I communicating this in a way that means something to that person, which maybe in a means that totally doesn't relate to how it resonates for you, but you have to convince that person in a framework that aligns with how they process and what matters to them.
Yeah, that makes that and some of the language that we've used around that is profiling somebody and understanding their motivational profile.
Right.
Before we get into that, because I think that's a good spot to go, but to kind of tie up, what's really driving people to make decisions. So it's either enhancement or preservation, and esteem being a big part of that.
Right.
If they have proper esteem or grounded esteem, they're more driven by the enhancement.
Right.
As we know, large majority of people do have esteem issues, so they're driven by more the preservation, the fear, the guilt.
Right. Or some combination thereof. And so if you understand if you understand those two drivers, part of what you do is, as you're communicating with people and you're trying to convince them of something, you make sure that as you're communicating, you're showing them how by saying yes to this, it's going to, in some way, shape, or form, enhance that person's life, or enhance how others perceive them, or enhance their opportunities, and how if they don't, this is potentially how things could slide backwards for them. So if you can speak to those, those two drivers as you're communicating with a person, regardless of really where they fall from an esteem perspective, or if they're just kind of middle of the road, you're hitting on two triggers.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's really giving kind of stakes to the decision, I guess, right?
Yep.
Here's the good stakes and here's the bad.
Right.
So that makes a lot of sense. So when people are being persuaded, or they're making these decisions, whether it's for enhancement or preservation, I think, I wanted to touch on logic versus emotion. Because I think we like to think we're a lot more logical than we actually are. So where is this coming from? How much of this these decisions or the way that we're persuaded is driven by logic versus emotion?
It's an interesting question. In one of our other podcasts, we talked a little bit about the human mind, right? And we talked about, in essence, the three tiers of how our brains evolve, right? So, the most primordial aspect of the human mind is which is the oldest aspect of our human mind is very much fight or flight, so there's a huge emotional component there. The mammalian aspect of our brain, which is the next oldest, is really the center of emotion. Beyond just fight or flight, but all of the other emotions that we feel. The youngest part of the human mind is the logic-driven side of things. Right. So, if you look at how we evolve, we automatically are going to default to the older aspects of things. So logic is the furthest away from what's driving the decision-making mechanism. So you're right. We like to convince ourselves that we make logical decisions, but it's nonsense. We make very emotional decisions, and then what we do is we try to justify those decisions.
We
with
rationalize
logic.
it afterwards.
Exactly. I remember years ago working with a group, and there was a lady in the group, and she had these leopard print, very high-heeled shoes that she was wearing. And, so I'm up in front of the group, and I said, can I borrow that shoe for a moment? And she kind of looks at me funny, but she takes off and she hands it to me. And I said, let's look at these shoes for a moment. I said, was this a logical purchase or an emotional purchase,
Yeah.
And the group just kind of starts laughing. And I said, it's not that they're not attractive shoes, but let's face facts, If you were buying logical shoes, you would buy flats,
Right.
You would buy something that had good support for your foot. You would buy, you'd be buying orthopedic shoes, you know?
Right.
So really, it's our decision-making process is much more emotional than it is logical.
Yeah. I think
if you can give people you speak to the emotion, but you give them the logic on the backside of it, again, now you're equipping them, so that they can feel good about their decisions.
Well, yeah, I think that's a major point too. Is what will actually cause them to make the decision is more emotion, but the logic part of it can still be a tripping point that you need to equip them to overcome.
Right.
What is the justification, so that they can point to it and say, "See, I'm rational.
Right.
I know
exactly.
what I'm smart."
Exactly. So now when my spouse comes and asks me about this decision or something like that, then you can back it up.
I did it because of this X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
Versus just no, honey, it was purely emotional.
Yeah. I don't know.
There's no logic to it at all. No, absolutely.
Yeah. Exactly.
I spent a lot of money, and there really is no reason why.
Yeah,
but it just made me feel good.
Yeah. So let's talk about let's circle back around to motivational profile, or kind of if we are making decisions more based on emotion and justifying them after the fact with logic, how do we know what the profile is of somebody, or how do we know what their emotional driver is, and then how do we speak to that?
Yeah. So there's kind of two different things. From a motivational perspective, there's a multitude of different motivational drivers that that we all have, which are in essence the things that light a fire in us, or will drive us, and you can get a sense of a person's motivational driver if you've observed them for a period of time, and also different motivational drivers will tend to cause people to gravitate towards certain career paths many times. So for example, one of the motivational profiles of individuals are competition-driven people. So somebody who has a competition-driven motivational profile, you tend to see them be more active in sports. If they're not a professional athlete, they will tend to go towards more competitive type career paths. Sales being one of them. Recognition is another motivational profile of people. In fact, if you look in sales careers, you'll tend to find salespeople will gravitate towards one of three motivational profiles. They'll either be competition driven, they'll be recognition driven, or they'll be financially driven. And so those will kind of be the triggers for them in life. There are people who are knowledge driven, and so for them it's they're very driven by learning and trying to so you see they're voracious readers. They candidly you are a knowledge driven profile.
That's probably fair.
You probably didn't notice that before, but if you pay attention to people, you'll notice those things.
Right.
There are people who are attention visibility driven profiles. They're probably the most dangerous of the motivational profiles of people, because a recognition-driven profile is somebody who, they want to be recognized because they're successful. They, so that drives them to do better. An attention visibility person, they want the limelight, but they don't really care how they get it. So they can seek it out from a negative perspective just as much as a positive perspective.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter if it's good or bad.
No, and so a lot of times in organizations, they'll be the shadow warriors who will be having, the meeting at the water cooler after the meeting, and and selling other people on, they're the kind of the quiet leaders in an organization who will move in negative fashions.
Yeah.
Because they want to be seen as important, they want to be seen as influential. And and they don't care whether it's on the positive or negative. Yeah, that makes them candidly kind of a pain in the ass from a business perspective.
Sure. And pretty much every other perspective.
Yeah, exactly. So having a sense of a person, from a motivational profile, it's helpful in persuasion. Because you understand somebody's triggers a little bit more.
Sure.
And that's a little different than that's more of a motivational driver than an emotional driver.
Okay.
The emotional driver is going to be much more tied to those two instincts, the preservation or the enhancement side of things, and they will tend to be either it'll tend to be either more internal or external for an individual. Internal, external can be either preservation or either enhancement. So, internal is much more, how somebody is perceived, how they perceive themselves, that side of things, where the external is more, more about the external environment, in that, is it opportunity? Is it fear? Is it, the keeping from sliding backwards, the loss of opportunity, those types of things.
Yeah.
So from an emotional driver standpoint, you're more looking at, is there for this person, is it more of the internal or external lotus that you want to speak to for somebody?
Okay. Got it. So for that, for the emotion, so the motivational profile is a little bit more maybe surface level, meaning that it's kind of where they'll light up a little bit.
It's what lights a spark in this person.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the emotional driver is more where they're making their decisions from.
Exactly.
Okay. So you mentioned internal or external, and it being enhancement or preservation focused. How do you tell if there's somebody that you're trying to convince of somebody? How do you tell where they fall?
A lot of it is if you listen to somebody speak, it's amazing what they will tell you, without really realizing that they're telling you those things.
Yeah.
So, you kind of get a sense of somebody, whether they, whether they're internally, externally validated, how much effort do they put into driving others' perception of them? Do they spend a lot of time and energy selling others on who they are and why they're valuable, those kinds of things, or is it is that something they don't really spend a lot of energy and effort on because they're more internally validated?
Sure.
So that gives you a sense of, are they more driven by an external perception or an internal perception?
Okay. So once you have and mostly that's just through observation. So once you have if there's somebody in particular you're trying to convince of something, once you have a feel for where they fall from a motivational profile perspective, but particularly from an emotional profile perspective, emotional driver perspective, how do you proceed? Is there a step-by-step process? Are there different techniques based on where they fall kind of in that spectrum?
Right.
How should we be thinking about that?
Well, first and foremost, if it's something that's important that you're trying to convince somebody of, it's the key piece is doing exactly what you just said, taking the time to think about it. What most people will do is they'll just go and have a conversation with somebody without really planning ahead of, okay, where is this person coming from? What is most important to this individual? How are they going about making this decision? How am I presenting it in a way that speaks to their enhancement or speaks to their preservation instincts? And so most people kind of shoot from the hip when it comes to persuasion, and then in turn get frustrated because
it's not working.
Exactly, because they see it so clearly in their mind, and why doesn't this person see it?
Yeah,
and rather than stepping back and saying, okay, if there's something that's in this person's best interest, and they're not moving, rather than looking in the mirror and saying, okay, the problem is not them, the problem's me.
Yeah, how I'm communicating this.
Exactly. I'm not communicating this in a way that is hitting this person's triggers.
Right.
And so if you're sitting down and premeditating, if this is something of importance, it's worth a little bit of forethought.
Yeah.
Well,
you mentioned you told me this story. It was probably a year or two ago, but I remember you talking about a conversation you had with Ben, and
you listen. You really listen.
I listen.
Sean.
Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes.
You validate me.
Externally focused. No, but I remember a conversation, a story you told about Ben, and
I'm really interested in seeing where this is going.
Yeah, do you not remember it? Yeah.
I don't remember what the story is. So.
It was, it was something where you mentioned you had planted a seed with him. You were driving in the car. You planted a seed with him weeks beforehand, and then you had a conversation with him about, kind of positioning him a little bit better to accept advice and feedback from you. And you asked him a couple questions. Are you remembering now?
Not entirely.
I just remember being, I guess, and this was a few years ago, but being very impressed, I guess, that, this was something that you said, like, yeah, I planted the seed with him, in this way 3 weeks ago. And then I waited and I waited and I waited. And then just kind of found the right moment 3 weeks later, and I asked him these 3 questions. And, bam, like he got right there.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that so many people don't do. They don't either take the time or have the foresight to really understand or put the effort into what's really going to move them.
Well, I think I remember what you're talking about. And I think with our kids, and as parents, obviously you're trying to raise your kids with a perspective of what's going to enable them in life, and also with a force field to protect them from all of the negative influences which would cause them to default to limiting perspectives. But if I and there's many times where Michelle and I with the kids have we've sat down and had conversations, candidly, I think it's been one of the perhaps best things that we've really done as parents is to have those conversations around, okay, so what is it we're trying to anchor in the kids' thought process right now? What is it that we're trying to help them to see, and then we'll create kind of a coordinated attack, in that perspective. And of course, we say things differently and from different perspectives and that, but it's that kind of cross vectoring that I think really helps. But with kids too, especially as they get into their teen years and those kinds of things, we've all been through that that phase where our parents got really dumb and didn't know anything, and that's the hardest time when you're as a parent, because you so often will see them going down pathways or where you're or grabbing onto perspectives that are limiting.
Yeah.
But they're not giving you the window to help them to see that.
Yeah.
And that's where that layering effect really makes a big difference. Joe said something to me years ago, and it was wonderful parenting advice. He said your kids, they will give you windows where you're connecting with them, and he said, but they're rare. And he said what most parents will do when their kids give them a window is they try to bludgeon them. They're trying to get in everything they wanted to get in for the last month, in the head. And he said, no, what happens is your kids, when you do that, they turn the cartoons on and they close the window,
right.
and then it becomes that much longer before they give you that window again. And I remember he goes, what you want to do, he goes, when your kids give you a window, he goes, you want to be like a sniper. He goes, get in, take your shot, and get the hell out of there as fast as you can,
Yeah.
And it was wonderful advice because, they don't have time to shut you down. And so you can go in and you can plant a seed, or you can, you deliver that theme. And that was the other thing with whether you're trying to convince your kids or trying to convince yourself or trying to convince somebody else, having those themes that you're working, and then coming back and and reinforcing those themes makes a big difference. And that was decidedly something that we did with the kids.
Yeah. Yeah. So, let's circle back to the techniques or the process of, you mentioned something there with, so once we understand their profile and, you mentioned their windows, you mentioned their themes, what are the techniques that we can be pulling away from this, where, all right, I took the time to understand and kind of get a feel for this person's profile. I know where I want to get them psychologically. Where do we go from there?
Yeah. So okay, let's go back to we'll go back to the story, right?
Yeah.
So, and I don't remember if this was specifically the one you're referencing or not, but the one that comes to mind when you're talking. I remember Ben went through a phase where it was particularly with school, where everything was like about, what's the quickest I can get done with my homework? What's the quickest I can get out, to kind of play and do the things that I want to do? And there was just a, kind of a general lack of effort and, with regard to school. And so my theme with him in that was one of minimums and maximums. And so when I had that window, I said, Ben, I said, in life you're going to have to make decisions and about how you want to approach things, and there's really only two options. I said you can approach things with a minimums perspective, which is what's the quickest I can do this, what's the least amount of effort I have to put into it, what's the least amount of thought that I have to use. So it's that's that minimums focus. And I said when people focus on minimums, they get minimum outcomes. And I said, does that make sense? And he's like, yeah, I guess so, And I said the other perspective is one of maximums, So it's, when somebody focuses on maximums, it's, what's the maximum I can do here? What's the best I can do this? What's the maximum benefit that I can gain from this? What's the most I can learn from this? And I said, so when people focus on maximums, they get maximum outcomes. And so that was like the extent of the conversation. That was the sniper shot.
Yeah.
When the window was open.
Yeah.
And
how did you know when the window was open?
With your kids, what happens is there's those they're in a more relaxed state. And you can see in their eyes that they're really they're listening and considering what it is that you're saying. The other way you can tell when the window's open is are they fighting you on what it is that you're saying, which would tell you the window's closed, or are they actually being a little introspective and considering what it is that you're saying?
Yeah.
So how much resistance are they putting up, basically?
Yeah. Okay.
So that was the sniper shot that I that I took. That was the theme, was minimums or maximums, and then what I would do is I would come back. So in the mornings, especially when I was in town, I would, a lot of times I'd walk him to the end of the driveway where he would get on the bus. And right before he'd get on the bus, I just, last thing I'd say to him is I say, hey, buddy, I said, remember, focus on maximums today. And just leave it at that.
Yep.
And then at night, when I was tucking him into bed, and I would ask him, I said, Ben, I said, what were your maximums today?
Yeah.
And in the beginning, he'd give me these kind of bull answers, or, I got a high score in Black Ops today, or something like that, and I go, okay, well, that's good, that's the maximum. But I just stuck with it, right?
Yeah.
And, so he of course knows his dad's a whack, and I'm not going away, So one day he says to me, he goes, I did the bonus question on the science exam today. I go, oh, okay. I said, would you have normally done the bonus question? He goes, nah. you know, and I go, great job, buddy. I go, that was a maximum. You know, so you asked about tools and techniques, you know, so there's the layering side of things, right? And so you create that theme that you keep coming back to.
Yep.
So, you know, so, you know, you create the themes, align it with their self-interest so that they can see that, by doing this, again, enhancement, preservation, right? Another big thing when you're trying to convince somebody of something is to, provide them with overwhelming social proof and, something that they can't debate.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right. So for Ben, I remember in that window of time, one of the things he was really into was watching these supercross races, motorcycle races inside stadiums, and so he and I'd watch these together on Sunday afternoons and things, and at the time, the two top racers, one was a guy Chad Reed, and another guy was Ricky Carmichael, right, and Ben kind of idolized Ricky Carmichael, so and he was probably the top guy at the time, and so we're watching a race one day, and I said to Ben, I said, when Ricky's out, training during the week, I said, when he gets up in the morning, do you think he says to himself, what's the least amount of time I need to spend riding today? What's the least amount of time I need to spend in the gym? What's the, the least amount of time I need to, spend, doing aerobic activity? Do you think he focuses on what the least amount is? Or do you think he asks himself, what's the maximum he can do today?
Yeah.
And so Ben, you could see his kind of little mind whirling. And he goes,
wheels turning.
He goes, he probably focuses on maximums.
Yeah.
And I said, I said, who's won the most races this year? And he goes, well, Ricky has. And I go, so look, he's getting maximum outcomes.
Yeah.
So people focus on maximums. They get maximums.
Yeah.
So there's the social proof for him.
Sure. Yeah.
But it was in a realm where he could relate to it.
Yeah.
And, so the more of that social proof, it's the validation for, of what it is you're trying to convince, somebody of.
Yeah.
So that, what that story also did is it really showed kind of the cause and effect, or the if-then kind of side of things.
Yeah.
So if you align it with people's self-interest, so they're speaking to the enhancement and the preservation instinct.
Yep.
You're providing overwhelming social proof to really validate why this decision is going to be the right one for them. You show the cause and effect, the if-then side of things. There was a book. I think I actually recommended it to you years ago. The book was called Persuasion, I believe.
Influence?
Or Influence, you're right, Influence.
Yeah. Cialdini.
Cialdini,
Yeah.
And, one of the things he talks about in that book is public acknowledgement is a big one, too.
Yeah.
If you can get somebody to publicly acknowledge something, state it out loud in front of other people, that also influences the likelihood that they will move in that direction.
Yeah, to keep with their cognitive consistency.
Right, exactly.
I already said this out loud, so I got to
Exactly.
continue to...
Well, and I said it in front of other people, so now there's a heightened level of commitment.
Right.
Because now if I don't do it...
I'm gonna look
exactly.
bad. I'm gonna look like an idiot.
And now you go back to the enhancement and preservation instinct.
Yeah, sure. So really you're understanding somebody's profile, and based on the profile and where you want to take them, you're coming up with a theme. Mm-hmm. The theme is wrapped in is as much cause and effect driven.
Yep.
And you're looking for your window to introduce the theme. You get your window, you take the sniper shot, you introduce the theme,
And then get the hell out of there.
And then get the hell out of there. Bail.
Yeah.
And so you introduce the team, you take the sniper shot, you get the hell out of there. And then over time, it sounds like you're reinforcing the theme that you introduced.
Yep.
And you're using social proof to do it. You're using stories to do it. Particularly things that are relevant to them. I think with Ben, Ricky was, guy he idolized. Right. So he's the perfect one to.
Well, and the social proof also is important because you remember the preservation side of people is, what drives buyer's remorse in people is the preservation instinct. It's that fear, like, oh, geez, I hope I didn't make a mistake, in making this decision, and that's part of the reason why people hate to decide. I remember years ago, there was a gentleman who I saw up in front of a group, and he was talking about how people hate to decide, and he goes, you know why people hate to decide? He goes, think about all of the words that end with the letters IDE. He goes, pesticide, homicide, suicide, decide.
Yeah.
He goes, they're all bad things.
Yeah.
He goes, no wonder people hate to decide. But so that the reluctance to make decisions is really driven by the preservation instinct. It's fear driven.
Yeah, they don't want to screw up.
Right, exactly. So the social proof, it creates the safety net.
Sure.
So you're showing them that that you're validating why this decision is going to be a safe one for them to make.
Yeah. Okay. So and you mentioned something last time we talked, and this was it was more personal when we were talking about judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that over time it wasn't so much. It was over time. All of a sudden, it felt like the dam broke.
Mm-hmm.
So is that kind of the same process in motion? In that, like for those people that were helping you from the outside
mm-hmm.
perspective, like we talked about, you kind of need that outside perspective to be objective. Is this kind of the process that they were following, and that you follow with other people? And is that why it kind of feels like this all of a sudden? Is this so over time? If you're layering this, is that how it happens? Is it feel like real quick all of a sudden I changed my mind, or is it? How does that process work?
It's a lot of the speed at which the decisions get made, or somebody changes their mind. It has a lot to do with how deeply rooted that belief that you're trying to change in them is.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to convince somebody of something that is very deeply psychologically rooted, it decidedly takes a lot more time, a lot more energy, more consistent theme. If you think about it for a moment, and also, how long has somebody held on to it for? So, our beliefs, our thought process, in a lot of ways, are like the roots of a tree. So if you've got a little sapling, you look at the roots and they're like hairs, right? So they're very easy to redirect. That's why children are so malleable.
Yeah.
But as they get older, they get less malleable. Because what happens is those thoughts and beliefs of theirs, they go bigger and they go stronger, and thus it takes more energy and more effort to redirect them.
Yeah.
In adults, those thoughts and beliefs are even bigger. So we've all walked down a sidewalk and you see, concrete slabs coming up because the root of a tree has pushed them up.
Yeah.
And it's a very old, mature tree.
Yeah. Old dog, new tricks.
Exactly. And that's the that same analogy applies to us as human beings. So if you're trying to convince somebody who's 55 years old of to change their perspective on something that's very deeply rooted,
sure,
it's a lot of time and a lot of energy to be able to do it. It takes a lot of consistency.
Right.
Whereas if it's a relatively minor thing, or, it's not a very deeply rooted belief, then it doesn't take anywhere near that amount of energy.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's an important distinction too. It's not necessarily that you can't convince older people of things. It's how deeply rooted it is for that person. Somebody that is 55 years old, they'll certainly have deeper held convictions, and it'll be deeper rooted in certain areas, but doesn't necessarily mean what you're trying to convince them of is one of those things.
Right.
It could be still a sapling.
Exactly. It's just,
it all depends.
Exactly. Is this a belief that they've held on to since they were in their teens?
Right.
Or is it something that's, you're right, is a relatively new perspective that they've recently taken?
Oh, okay. Yeah. I can see that.
Yeah.
Okay. So, to wrap up, one thing I wanted to do is kind of flip this 180. So we've been talking, this whole conversation has been about, how do we convince somebody else of something? Should we be thinking about that, flipping it around and saying, does it make sense to be trying to convince ourselves of anything?
Oftentimes convincing ourselves is Joe is, he's got a wonderful quote. He said, the most important sale anybody ever makes in their life is a sale they make to themselves to be their best.
Yeah.
And so, ultimately, if we're going to convince anybody of anything, it really does come down to convincing ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's the, we all cross that bridge many times every day. It's when you wake up in the morning, or when you're laying in bed in the morning and it's 6 a.m., and you roll over and you look at the clock and you're saying, oh, okay, I could get up and go down on the treadmill right now, or go for a run, or I could roll over and sleep for another 45 minutes, Right. And so what are you convincing yourself of there, or, am I convincing myself that, I'm trying to lose 10 pounds and therefore I should shy away from that donut that's screaming at me in the kitchen right now, so we cross that road thousands of times every day, and we make those decisions, and for many individuals, they convince themselves of the things that provide the most instantaneous gratification. The challenge is we know that everything's cause and effect in the world, is that if somebody lives their life that way for a period of time, inherently what they're doing is they're sacrificing their future in the process. So we've got to ask ourselves, everything that we do, every decision we make, it builds some type of a momentum for us. Is it building positive momentum towards our future, or is it building negative momentum towards our future?
Yeah, I like the momentum, analogy. I think that's a great way to think about it. And I think it's kind of in two parts. It's before you can convince somebody else of something, you have to, first believe it yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true, because I think it seems like humans have a very good kind of instinctual meter of, does this person really believe it or not? Mm-hmm. And I think, it seems like that the conviction with which you deliver whatever the message that you're trying to deliver has a massive impact on whether they believe it or not.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I mean, at the highest level of sales, the best salespeople I've ever met are not the most fluent. They're not the most articulate. They're not the ones who have the stunning technical knowledge or aptitude or any of those things. They really are the ones who believe the most. And to your point, what people really buy from us is they buy the conviction they see in our eyes.
Yeah.
Because that if they see that conviction, it gives them confidence. If they see trepidation, then then they're going, well, if this person is uncertain, then why should I be certain?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So you're 100% right, and and you're right. We are exceptionally good at reading those cues in people. I don't know that many people are necessarily conscious of that.
Yeah.
But on a subliminal level,
it's the gut. People,
yeah,
it's that gut decision.
Exactly.
That people just point to their gut.
Yep.
They couldn't. I can't tell you why, but I don't know. It just doesn't.
It's just
seem
not
right.
ringing for me right now. Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. So, in order to convince others, we must first convince ourselves. Do some of those same or all of the same techniques apply? If we're trying to, so whether it's all right. I'm sitting here and I'm like, all right, Dave, I gotta convince Dave of something, and I think through what it is that I need to. I think through your profile and the theme, and look for the window and all that kind of stuff. And I'm saying I gotta convince myself first, like so, because Dave's gonna be able to tell, do I really believe this or not?
Yep.
Does the for me trying to get myself to that level of conviction, can I use some of the same kind of techniques that we were talking about before to, how do I get myself there?
Yeah. And absolutely the same, the same things work. You think about, Benjamin Franklin, the Benjamin Franklin close, salespeople are taught where they kind of do the T chart and, if I do and if I don't kind of, things. Think about that. It speaks to the enhancement and preservation instinct.
Yeah.
And so if we're trying to convince ourselves of something, whether it's convincing ourselves to go to the gym, or, we talked about a minute ago that many people, they'll default to what is most, immediately gratifying to them.
Sure.
And by default, sacrifice the future. But if someone's sitting there and they're really stepping back, and if it's important, okay, working out, right?
Yeah.
If they go through that exercise and think about, okay, so, if I start working out, or if I start working out consistently, how's this going to enhance my life, right?
Yeah.
How's this gonna, you know what? I'll give you a real world situation.
Perfect.
Years ago, working for one of our clients, I was talking to a lady, one of the managers in this organization, and wonderful lady, very health conscious, good shape, but she smoked. And I remember we were sitting in an afternoon, we were sitting talking one afternoon, and she said, I've smoked now for over 25 years, and I asked her, I said I know that you're health conscious, that you go to the gym, I said I'm curious why, and she said she goes, when I was a kid, my older sister smoked, and she said, and I idolized my older sister, so I thought she was cool, so I started smoking because I wanted to be cool like my older sister. And she goes, now I'm in my mid-30s, and she goes, I don't really think it's so cool anymore,
Yeah.
She goes, but nonetheless, she goes, I can't seem to break the habit. And she had gone through all manner of things to try to overcome this. She'd been hypnotized, and she'd tried acupuncture, and she'd done the those nicotine patches and the gum, and all of the stuff that people go through. And she said, I find myself, I'm able to quit for a couple of weeks, and she goes, but then something happens, and I end up with a cigarette back in my hand again. So we're sitting there talking, and I said to her, I asked her, I said, well, her name was Kathy. I said, Kathy, I said, if you were to, quit smoking, I said, what difference would it make in your life, And she said, my son's a teenager, and she said, one of my fears is that the smoking, I'm going to end up with lung cancer or something like that. And she goes, and I might not be around to be able to watch my son, get married. And, so she said, so quitting smoking certainly helps me in that regard. And I said, well, why else would it be important to, quit smoking? And she's like, well, she goes, it's expensive to smoke, She goes, and she goes, if I look at what I spend every year just buying cigarettes, she goes, I could definitely find another use for that money. And she goes, and candidly, she goes, I try not to, she said, but she goes, if you smoke, people know you smoke, you smell like you smoke, She goes, I wouldn't stink, my clothes wouldn't stink, so she goes through, these reasons how her life would get better if she was to quit smoking, and and I said, well, what about the other side? I said, why is it a good idea for you to keep smoking? What would, if you try to slide back, how would your life slide backwards if you quit smoking? And she goes, the one thing that I find is that when I quit, I eat more. And she goes, so I think that, smoking kind of helps me to, to keep from overeating, and she goes, and it also helps me to deal with my stress. When I find I smoke more when I'm stressed. And so I asked her, I said, so which of those things are you focusing more on? The benefits that you're going to gain from quitting, or the benefits you gain from, continuing smoking?
Yeah.
She's like, I never really thought about that before. I said, which is more important to you? I said, is it, more important to you to, have, some means to kind of relieve that immediate stress? I said, or is it more important for you to watch your son walk down the aisle?
Yeah.
And, and she's like, it's not even up for debate.
Right.
And, and so I said, that's what you got to do. You got to pay attention to yourself. What do you, which is driving your decisions?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's super important. And I think it's true for whatever you're trying to convince yourself of. So for that, for that woman, I think it's one thing to understand intellectually. She has that conversation with you, and there's the window.
Yep.
Right, and there's the theme. How is it over time? Because she has that conversation, and she leaves that room or whatever. How is it she's going to consistently, convince herself of that?
Right.
As opposed to, all right, I had the conversation, or intellectually I got to this place where, like, all right, this side is better than that side.
Right.
And I understand that intellectually or rationally or logically, but we don't make decisions logically or rationally. So how do I get from understanding it rationally to understanding it more emotionally or viscerally?
And that is, it really comes down to the, we talked about how, using themes with Ben. It's what are the themes that we're using with ourselves?
Yeah.
And, how are we speaking to ourselves? How are we, how do we sell ourselves, in the value of getting in the gym? How do we sell ourselves on the value of not picking up that cigarette? What is the, what's the messaging we're giving to ourselves? Because if we don't give ourselves a, an alternative messaging, we'll default to the, to the past behaviors.
Or pre-programmed.
Exactly. So, I had this morning there was on the help a reporter thing. One of the requests from a reporter was to entrepreneurs or executives about I'm trying to think what the wording was. something about it was, something to the effect of perpetuating habits that are self-benefiting, or so it was kind of how do you make sure that you're basically protecting yourself in the process of running this business or running this company or those kinds of things,
Sure.
right? And I remember I read that request, and that was one of the things that went through my mind, was the battles that even I face. In the morning, I tend to work out first thing in the morning before I come into the office, but there's decidedly days where there's a almost like I feel guilty, for going to the gym, and I could be in the office an hour earlier, those kinds of things.
Yeah, sure.
And so there's that kind of tug of war that you feel,
Right.
and you have to be able to mentally override that and realize that, I could get into the office an hour earlier, but at the end of the day, the most important thing in my life is my health, because if I don't have that, nothing else matters.
I can't do any of the other stuff.
Right. And so again, are you building positive or are you building negative momentum?
Right.
And so it's, you have to create those themes, and you have to live with those themes,
Yeah.
in order to change the behaviors.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's all the questions I have
There you go.
on persuasion. Your brain had not been completely picked. Any closing thoughts or anything like that before we wrap up?
I think that from a topical standpoint, and I love the last question that you went to, which was really about convincing ourselves.
Yeah.
And the Joe said to me years ago, it was actually, I remember we were in the parking lot of a shopping mall, and so we're just sitting in a car having a conversation, and he said to me, he goes, I've been thinking about something a lot lately. And I was like, what's that? And he said, he goes, everything in life is cumulative. He goes, it's kind of my cumulative theory. And I remember we're sitting there talking about it, and that's where he really started talking to me about that concept of momentum. He goes, if somebody does something one time, it doesn't really make too much of a difference. As long as it's not some catastrophic thing like hurting somebody or something like that. He goes. So if somebody does something once, he goes, in most cases it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But if they do it 2, 3, 4, 5 times, all of a sudden it starts making a difference. He goes, because everything is cumulative. And he said, we tend as human beings, we tend to look at things in snapshots and not think about the cumulative nature of things. And that conversation always weighed heavy in my head, because I really started to look at so many of the decisions that I was making, whether it was how I was interacting with my kids or Michelle, or the decisions I was making in my career, or how I was even treating myself, and looking at what am I accumulating here? Am I building positive momentum? Am I building negative momentum? Because you're always doing one or the other.
Yeah, sure.
And if you build enough of either one, it starts to matter a lot.
Yeah, it's compound interest.
Exactly. And so, all of those little decisions that we make, if we use that as a referencing point of, all of a sudden it's like what seems like a trivial choice has a lot more weight.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thanks, Dave.
You're welcome.
Hey guys, one more thing before you take off. This is Motivational Intelligence Insider. It's just a very short, exclusive email every Monday that comes from Dave, John, and the guests on this show. This is the only place they share their very, very best stuff, and it's delivered right to your inbox every single Monday. This could include exclusive tips for upping your game, articles they're reading, videos they're watching, stories from the road, and on and on. It's the best way to kick off your week, and this content comes directly from Dave, John, and the guests, and is only available to subscribers of Motivational Intelligence Insider. So if you want these guys and gals to email you their best stuff, go to 2logical.com/insider. That's the number 2logical.com/insider, and drop in your email. And if you do, I hope you enjoy.
The Motivational Intelligence podcast is produced by the team at 2Logical. 2Logical is an international corporate training firm and the world's leading expert in motivational intelligence, which is the ability to understand, manage, and change the motives people have. 2Logical offers over 30 different keynotes, workshops, and full training courses to small, medium, and large Fortune 500 companies in 53 countries, a lot of which you're probably familiar with: Pfizer, Bank of America, GE, Constellation Brands, P&G, and more. All solutions are completely customized, and the feedback from these sessions will blow your mind. If you have any training or speaking needs or just want to say hey, head over to 2logical.com.